I want to start by re-asking something I asked you when we spoke for Boys State in 2020. Obviously, whole new, unique experience here that offers so many grand stories and nuggets of wisdom and beautiful moments of these ladies supporting each other. How did these human experiences further ground you both and change what's important to you to capture as storytellers and truth seekers?
Mm. Well, I think I think we live in challenging times, dark times. I think I fear for our country, our democracy. I fear for our ability to kind of engage in constructive and civil discourse that helps us confront the problems we face, which are enormous. And I'm looking for ways to be hopeful. And I think this film, I didn't know what I would find. I knew that Boys State did fill me with some hope and optimism in finding these young voices, even voices that I disagree with politically. I really respected, like
Mhm.
Ben, and so I think that we were looking as the parents of two teenage girls to looking for ways to understand how young women are confronting this moment and whether they can show us a way forward that feels healthier. And I think we did find that, the girls we met, we were terrified to follow up Boys State. You've seen it, it sort of
Right.
kind of worked perfectly in ways we could have only dreamed about. And so it's a hard act to follow, frankly. But once we started talking to these girls in casting and met Emily and Ochi and the rest of them, we were like, okay, we don't know what's going to happen, but we're in good hands. And this is going to be really a ride, an inspiring one.
Yeah. If I remember correctly, Jesse, I think you compared or tried to make sense of shaking everything that you have in your mind going
Yeah.
into these stories to Terminator, if I remember correctly.
Oh, yeah, that's right.
Yeah, which makes perfect sense to me, but I'm curious just because, as you mentioned, you have two teenage daughters.
Yeah. Yeah.
Was there any more trouble in trying to shake off everything that's happened in the
We'll
past
use that
5 years?
metaphor again. Or
No, I love it, but I'll just say this. But I want Amanda to answer this. We brought our daughter into production, and
Yeah.
like often with documentary work, I kind of try to leave things behind to that point. It's sort of to go with a kind of open heart and open mind, to suspend my prejudices, my San Francisco, I'm like a liberal guy, whatever, whatever. I make documentary films. Let go of that. Just be like kind of present in the moment and be a good listener and kind of work from an emotional and an intuitive place as a storyteller.
Mhm.
But which I think we tried to do together. But also, we brought our 16-year-old daughter to be a PA, and I think it was a way to say, let's do this together as a family, because she's at an age now where she could identify with these young women. She could work with her parents and see what it is we do for a living and how weird it is. And so I think that was a sort of approach, and so in some ways philosophically similar, and surrendering ourselves to kind of the unscripted gods.
No, but I think you're right. I think we brought more to this one than the last one.
Yeah.
And part of that is, I mean, there's so many pieces to that. Part of it's personal. Part of it is that we're 4 years further into hyperpolarization in our country. And I think things are even that much more. You can't deny that there's this massive gulf. And how people talk over that space or in spite of that space is even more kind of startling a project to get into. And then you had the kind of emotional legacy of COVID, right? And people
Mhm.
gathering anywhere in person without masks to share an experience felt so overwhelming and emotional that I can't say that I was as much of an observer as I was. I mean, I was like emotional just when they all walked into an auditorium. I was like, this is amazing. You know what I mean? So
Yeah.
you're a little more sensitive maybe than last time, because my daughter was there, because it was the first time I was in a big group gathering, and because our country is, I'm more scared than I was even
Yeah.
4 years ago.
Mm.
So that's an interesting, thank you. I hadn't really thought about that.
I mean,
but our nature as people, as storytellers, is very much to listen. So I wouldn't say that
Yeah.
I'm like going in with an agenda. You know, yes, I know that teenage girls have certain truths to them that I did see when the sessions started. You know, they're hard on themselves, and
Yeah.
they tend to be, yeah, they tend to be more willing to listen actually than boys. Those kind of things. There was some confirmation of stuff I came in with, but for the most part, I had never met somebody like Emily before. You know,
Hmm.
I never actually met somebody like Brooke before. I'd never met somebody like Toshi. So this was all good and new to the point where I was learning, right? And that's what
Right.
that's why we do it.
I just, the one other final point I make about this is that, you know, and I think the Terminator analogy came from doing production by myself, mostly with Amanda as a
Mm.
producer here in the edit room, and when I was in the field. But this was a chance to work with a big team of other cinematographers, and for by documentary standards, like 30 people, which is a very large crew. And there was something invigorating about working together, you know, because I think we all feel a sense of isolation, whether it's political isolation or sort of COVID related isolation, social isolation that comes with sort of modern living. The ability to work together as a group, but also to be a part of this larger ecosystem was really, I told the crew, I remember when we were wrapping that like, this is the only way I if I could only make movies that way, I would. I can't, but I love it because it's actually so unusual.
You spoke about being observers, and you both do such an incredible job at capturing the reality of this, and just being listeners, and showing growth from beginning to end, and turning losses into wins. What is your headspace at when it comes to capturing the truth, being observers, but also protecting these young ladies as well?
I think it starts early with who you cast.
Right.
Um, because I don't think this project of collaborating with us is right for everybody, particularly at that age. So we talked to hundreds of kids um, before we landed on the people that we landed on. And part of that conversation is explaining what the process is explaining, just recognizing in them that they have a confidence in who they are, and that they don't change how they behave in front of the camera, and that they know what they're getting into, by the way, at Girl State, which is itself its own kind of just crucible and just intense ask of them in terms of performance. Like you're gonna have to write speeches, give speeches, meet 1,000 people, etc. So who can handle it and share themselves honestly is not everybody. And I think finding those kids who are strong enough is the beginning, but also, you know, sharing with them in the process of what we're filming, when we're filming it. They can always ask us to turn the camera off. We share a rough cut of the film. You know, we're in conversation with their parents because they're at 17, they're still minors. It's a really interesting age, right? They're adults, but also living at home. I mean, kind of thing.
I mean, that the term observational, which I kind of rejected as a documentary filmmaker, implies a kind of clinical distance. And I think the work is, as you know, like much more collaborative and active. It's an active listening and a recognition that the relationship goes well beyond just the period of production, that extends into this phase of the film where we're with them, and we very much want them to be part of the conversation around the film publicly. So that entails a greater level of exposure and responsibility. And when we filmed with them to start, they were minors too, so it involved parental consent. And again, as parents, you know, whenever I don't know, my kids have come home and they've said, "Oh, you know, somebody was filming a commercial for, you know, cornflakes or something," and I was like, you know, like, wait, you know, like, I'm very protective of my kids. I understand that, and like when you're asking somebody to present this kind of vulnerability and share their stories as 17-year-olds, to be able to look back at that and see it in a constructive way, that's a lot to ask. So I think that's right. Just exercising care and building those relationships.
Even for me, like the bad, and I guess the good side of like something like Facebook is I have access to it all the way back to my teenage years, and I'm looking at stuff that I said on there, and I'm like, oh man, I'm not proud of that at all. And so, and this is a time in the formative years of our lives that you're capturing,
Yeah.
But there's so much nuggets of wisdom here, especially with like what Emily said about like refraining from revealing her political party because she would lose half the audience right there. And then there was a point that was made on stage about like making a point to straighten the crown versus pointing out that it's crooked. So, are there any nuggets within everything that you've captured here that you're most hanging on to and putting forth some in some way or form in your life?
Well, I'd offer one. I think it's articulated by Cece towards the end of the film, or Faith and Cece both talk about. It's when the program is wrapping up, and they're sort of talking about. Faith is talking about the sort of sneaky sort of systems that are in place in our society that are obstacles to women gaining more power, equal representation, and political leadership. Our society is sexist, right? And the opportunities we provide to women, the resources we provide, the expectations we offer them. And I love that the story is of girls who maybe didn't, like Emily, see those systems, discovering them, calling them out. And I think I think of myself as a fairly enlightened person with a strong creative partner who's a woman and these two wonderful teenage daughters. But I think to have the sort of curtain fall away and to expose this inequity of these two systems, these boys and girls programs, which have different levels of funding, different expectations for how young people should behave, how much autonomy they should be given, and to talk about politics. It's kind of, and I don't think it just speaks to the programs themselves, but to our society as a whole. And I think that to me was a kind of an invisibility made visible through their eyes, which is, I don't know, that's not like a single statement in the film, but it's the message of the film for me. One of the messages beyond their inspiring strength.
Yeah. Yeah. And I know we're just about out of time, so I wanted to cut you loose on asking about the poetry within here, even from like a visual standpoint, because you have, the camera, like the camera's like bookended, the film's bookended with two shots of like walking past all the ladies behind them. But then there's some thought put into how you were going to start the film with the Mary Poppins story. So I'm curious about how poetry in your lives has like led to some of the decisions that you made as storytellers in crafting this film.
I wish I could tell you that it was, premeditated or organized that way. I really think it's just we've taken in to our brains and hearts probably many films, many books, many pieces of writing, many characters and opera, whatever, and in our real lives, and then filtered it through who we are, and we just make those decisions. I think it's very intuitive. Just what ends up making it in the film is does this lineup of images and plot and character, does it approximate the experience we had accurately and honestly enough when we filmed what we filmed? Does it present what we experienced? And I think it takes us forever to get it right, the sequencing and which we had, for instance, that shot of the Mary Poppins, there's 4 cameras filming her. Why did we choose that one that was on stage close to her that rolls around her? I mean,
I think
because it felt right, and it felt like the experience of what our journey was making the movie. And that's my bad answer to your good question.
It's a great question, and I like all of your questions, actually.
Yeah.
They're different than most journalists. I would say that, and for example, with the woman who opens the film, she's not a character in the film.
Right.
She's a spirit.
In some ways, it's like not a conventional decision. And I think so much of that process that you're alluding to is about letting go of the conventional expectations that we carry with us about how a story should be told or how it should feel. And I think, poems are often quite short, but they take a long time to write because there's a juxtaposition of words and the images they convey. And there's a distillation to poetry, and I think that is part of the editorial process that Amanda's alluding to. That you can't cheat the distillation process, even though films have many more. There's so many images, thousands of images to work with, and they have all this sort of balancing act of narrative coherence and emotional character development that has to be sustained, along with the sort of meaning that's derived from, you know, juxtaposition. And so I think it's letting go of like some of the, I think it's a little bit back to the Terminator metaphor too, but you have to like let go. You have to let go of like conventional expectations, or like the boring documentary version. You have to get through the boring documentary version of your film to get to the better, maybe more poetic version that might not please everybody, but pleases you fundamentally. And I think is like an approximation of what you felt, saw,
Yeah.
you know, and sometimes those are only expressed visually or in ways that are not so clearly narrative, right?
Right. I mean, I shouldn't add more, but like to me, Karis, who's the opening Mary Poppins, she's also the person who plays the marimbas later. She's sort of spirit of an old-fashioned presentation of womanhood to me. And she showed up during the week again when we filmed. She gave a speech. She keeps showing up in her little pantsuits, and she's very put together, and she's super smart, but she kind of was she was a presence for me throughout the week that that I think is part of what the girls are both galvanized by, but also what they're pushing against a little bit. Like, you know, this sort of female empowerment, yes, but, right? And so that to me is what, you know, it's interesting to open your film with not one of your characters, but with this emotional feeling, which we hit a little more nail on the head with, like, our title sequence is very like documentary, right? Like representation, it's a stake, you know, it's like we have a problem, and girl state is one of the solutions, or is it? You know, I just think that all of this and what we do is like a little bit of an act of representation. We're making a film about women in roles of leadership that other women will see and then see themselves in women's of leadership, and then hopefully that kind of is a feedback, not a feedback loop. It's the opposite of a feedback loop. It leads to something.